Hey everyone, it's your girl Maddie here, aka Beaver Mosh, and today I'm joined with Lux and Brett of Soulmass. Brett, Lux, how are you doing today? Thanks for being with me tonight.
Doing pretty good.
Doing great. Good to be here.
Yeah, well, Soulmass, for my listeners who may be unfamiliar, earlier this year put out their record Let Us Pray. How has the past handful of months been since you've put that out? Like, what has been the reception to it been?
I think it's been pretty good. This was probably the album I think a lot of people were waiting for us to do the most.
Mm-hmm.
And one we planned to do almost immediately back in 2014 when the game came out. Um, and definitely the one we spent the most time on, just musically, lyrically, everything about it. Poured a lot of time into that. And I think the receptions, thankfully, so far have been pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Just had a vinyl release on Syrup Moose.
Yeah,
Yep, we still have some vinyl and CDs available if you haven't gotten your copy yet.
that's
Uh,
true.
well, I did bring you on to talk about, well, to have a little conversation about video games and metal. But first, I really want to dive deep into your band. What is Soulmass and what do you do respectively in the band?
Brett, go ahead and start.
Soulmass, we started I back on a forum when those were still a thing.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah. It's literally when we found out we both like, Dark Souls lore, like before it was like a really big YouTube topic kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, the first album, I did music vocals and some lyrics here and there. But after that, I pretty much just focused on writing music to whatever Lux's outline or vision for the next album is. Like the second album, we knew it would be, Dark Souls 2, mostly Demon Souls, and some additional lore we didn't cover. And then for Let Us Pray, I had an actual full outline Lux had done for each song, what it was about. And then I wrote music to that outline, and then they went back and did lyrics to the finished music.
Hmm.
Yeah, setting up from the beginning when we met each other on the forum, we both really kicked it off with the same sort of taste in music as far as what we wanted to do with the band. We started off kind of like kicking back and forth, we want to do a little bit of Bolt Thrower, a little bit of Sweet Death, a little bit of Cannibal Corpse, and then throw in some doom metal and like some Bell Witch and
Yeah.
like just mix it all up and see what happens. And I think we hit a nice little unique balance. And then once we had the music, it's like, well, we both like Dark Souls a lot. This just
Yeah.
sort of fits the mood. So let's just run with it. And it just kind of happened.
Yeah, and seem to be typically categorized as Death Doom. Is that kind of how you would classify yourself? Do you agree with that label?
Yeah, I would
Absolutely.
agree with that. I mean, that's pretty much what we aim for. Especially with Let Us Pray, we knew that was going to be like very dramatic and doomy in a lot of
Hmm.
parts.
Yeah, we throw in a little bit of melody, so it's definitely more than just death metal. There's a lot of our doom influence in there. We're definitely big fans of, like I said, Bell Witch when it comes to like Funeral Doom,
Hmm.
Loss, um, and then we throw in like obviously we named our band Soul Mass. We are big fans of Candlemass, so that wasn't a coincidence either.
Hmm.
Actually, not Soulmass Homing Arrow, surprisingly enough.
Well, what drew you to metal in the first place? What about it kind of spoke to you and like said, okay, this is my music. This is what I want to pursue. This is what I want to listen to and create.
My first exposure was with my sister, actually.
Interesting.
She's 3 years older than me, so when I was like 8 or 9 or so, she was starting to listen to like Metallica, Korn, and a lot of the new metal at the time.
Hmm.
Um, and Korn and Metallica were probably like my first metal bands I listened to. And from Metallica, I got to Judas Priest and Iron Maiden.
Yeah.
Once I got to Iron Maiden, that's kind of like when it was sold for me. Like, guitar oriented heavy music was what I really liked.
I forged a pretty similar path to Brett. I started off really just listening to a lot of just like classic rock and stuff growing up with my parents.
Hmm.
And then as I progressed and actually like listening to music on my own, like in middle school, early high school, I got really big into punk rock and I was really into punk, which transitioned me really well into Metallica when I heard Kill 'Em All for the first time. It's like,
Hmm.
wow, this is really awesome. And it kind of fits in that sort of punk atmosphere. So that transitioned me really well into the classic Bay Area thrash stuff. And from there, after I found Iron Maiden, like Brett, I just kind of fell in love. I was like, this is exactly what I want to listen to forever. Just these beautiful guitar harmonies and these driving rhythms.
Yeah.
Absolutely love it.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. That's you can't go wrong with Maiden. Brett, I see the Maiden poster in your room. Just
Yeah,
what's your favorite Maiden record, if I have to ask?
it's Brave New World, and it has been. So that was I was probably 12 when I heard that.
Hmm.
And it's my favorite album of all time is either Brave New World or Bruce Dickinson's Chemical Wedding, just kind of depending on my mood. But Brave New World was the album that not only just made me really love metal, but made me want to play guitar too. Like Dave Adrian Janik's solo work on that album is just phenomenal. Like I still listen to that album a lot.
And it's when they introduced like that three guitar, setup, and people were like, "How is this going to work?" And they clearly made it work.
Yeah, that was the just and seeing it live too. Rock in Rio, which came out like the following year, that live album was hugely influential to me. I still remember most of those songs, by what Bruce Dickinson says in between songs on Rock in Rio.
It's
Yeah,
the same for me, actually. Brave New World actually came out on my 16th birthday. So I'm aging myself, but that is the album that got me into Iron Maiden and the one that got me into metal in general, beyond like, Metallica and
yeah,
Megadeth and stuff. So that's my absolute favorite. Just I'm
yeah,
biased at this point.
yeah. And it was Bruce's glorious return. So yeah, I also adore Brave New World. It's at least in my top three.
Yeah, it's
Um,
up there.
yeah. So clearly, the reason I chose you to have this conversation with is you are a band that incorporates elements, as you said, from games such as the Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and how do you go about that? Do you find an image in a game while you're playing it and it sparks a lyric, or do you kind of sit down and say it's time to write the album, and then you think of games you've incorporated and you like kind of try to bring that lore into it? How are you bringing in the concepts behind your lyrics and your themes?
It's
That's
been
mostly on Lux, so I'll send that one to them.
Yeah, it's been a little bit different for each album.
Hmm.
Starting off, it was Brett did have a little bit more that he brought to Despairing Fates, which was our first album, where he wrote some lyrics for that one as well. So there were some songs like Hollow and Crushed by the Brand where he had an idea from the get-go and he kind of wrote the music to fit the mood he was going for.
Hmm.
Otherwise though, all the other songs and like most of the weakness of virtue and like you said with Let Us Pray, I had a whole outline for him. It's just been me just following the mood of what he's written. Basically, he'll present me with a whole bunch of songs. I think for the weakness of virtue we had like over 20 songs and I ditched almost all of them and just picked the ones I liked and said, hey, I like these and I'm going to make this one about that and this one about that. It's just whatever I felt about the music and whatever uh it reminded me of when I really listened to it. That's what I assigned to as far as the lore and the story I wanted to present with it. But then, like circling back to Let Us Pray, is a little bit reverse. I had an outline from the beginning with that one. When I finished Bloodborne, I outlined it for an album. I said, "This is the way I want the album. I want this song to be this, blah blah blah," and then I just threw it at Brett and said, "Here, whenever you write it, just write it like this," and that's how it turned out.
And that worked pretty well for me because with my other band, Last Scale Shroud, I would generally write music first, knowing what the song was going to be about.
Hmm.
So when I had the outline for Let Us Pray, we didn't end up with any extra songs. Like every song I wrote for, whatever they had for the outline was the one we used. There was extra material I wrote just because I was, I had stuff to write, which is the three songs that are coming out on the EP on October 6th, I think is the date.
Yep.
Otherwise, everything on Let Us Pray was, I wrote it chronologically. It went just through the songs in order of the outline, and just focused on the themes and like lyrical ideas they had in the outline. And that's how we got it. It was actually written pretty quick. It just took a while to get out.
Sick. Well, gaming culture, and this is kind of a great segue into kind of like the main conversation I was wanting to have with you two is gaming culture seems to have, at least in my observation, an intersection with metal fandom and metal music, and you're not the only band that kind of explores that. And so I want to ask why. It's a question I've done with other bands, but I've never really done this deep dive that I've wanted to, and I'm fascinated by it. So why is there that crossover? Why are there so many Elder Scrolls themed black metal bands and other games?
I think it's there's a lot of variable reasons. Different people come into metal for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
As similar as Brett and I have been, there's other people who have completely different journeys into getting into metal and what metal means to them. I think one facet that we definitely need to focus on is um, from the video game side of things, the video game music of like our generation, we're millennials. We grew up with like the NES, the Super NES, the Genesis, all of those generations of consoles. And back then, a lot of the music in the games was inspired by rock and heavy
Mm-hmm.
metal. So you'd be straight up listening to Rockman, which was Mega Man over here, and the entire soundtrack is this kick-ass metal and rock soundtrack just in the form of video game,
Yeah.
sound fonts. And it's like there's not exactly a big bridge to gap to say, hey, I loved playing these games when I was a kid. And then once I started getting into music, oh wow, there's music that sounds like all those video games that I liked. So I think that's part of it. And
Mm-hmm.
I think another side of it coming from the music side um, is that there's definitely like I know Brett and but we're I'm speaking for Brett a bit, but I don't think he'll mind. There's definitely a sizable portion of the metal community who are neurodivergent, and I believe that neurodivergent communities tend to hyperfixate on these things that have a lot of commonality, and we get into things and hyper focus on them like video games or heavy metal. So it
Mm-hmm.
just so happens that if we're really into video games, we might just also be really into heavy metal or punk or whatever else. It's just an intersection, I think.
Yeah. I don't think I've never mentioned on the show, but I am diagnosed as autistic. And yes, I I resonate that with it. I've obviously have gotten very into metal. I have a show about it. So yes, I understand what you're describing there.
Yeah, and from musically, Lux covered pretty much all of it. Like there's a lot of similarities. And if you look at all the composers, like especially with I know me and Lux both love 90s JRPGs, especially the music. That stuff's always been like a huge love of ours. If you look at their influences, a lot of it, is 80s metal and hard rock and like jazz fusion from Japan and stuff, which was always to my ears like a little bit heavier than the stuff you hear in the States. But I think thematically, a lot of video games are just like very similar to like that grandiose and theatrical nature of metal. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you have metal albums that draw on like classic mythology and stuff. And there's a lot of video games whose, stories and narratives are inspired by the same things. Like Skyrim, Elder Scrolls, or any of the Dungeons and Dragons stuff. So it's a pretty natural fit to me anyway, to want to like marry those two. Just the stories and narratives of video games, I think, lend themselves very well to the atmosphere of metal.
Hmm.
And I think that was one of the things with Soulmass we wanted to do. Is Dark Souls is a very bleak, depressive, and heavy atmosphere, and
Yeah.
we thought that's kind of how the music should be, at least in a metal context, should kind of reflect that. Lyrically and musically, a lot of like I always go to like Keeper of Cowardice is probably like still our heaviest, darkest song. But I think that really gets the atmosphere of what that game was doing, just in every element, right? And I think it's natural stuff like doom metal and death metal to just go straight towards like a dark medieval type game like Dark Souls.
Hmm.
And
And
to go back to again the conversation of how metal and video games are interconnected, I think there's also a bit of synchronicity with the rise of video games and the rise of heavy metal.
mhm.
Both of them first started up around the same time, started getting popular around the same time in the 80s. And it's just, I think there's a lot of overlap because of that with young people.
And what is it about for you two, Dark Souls specifically, that's so captivating? Why do you love that game series so much?
That's a
I
deep
would say
question.
Mhm.
uh, I've actually thought about this one a lot, and I think it's not necessarily the games as a whole, but in any Soulsborne game, from Demon Souls even up to Elden Ring, there's always a facet of identity in the storyline somewhere, or among a character somewhere, especially characters losing identity.
Mhm.
Even though Dark Souls 2 like wasn't my favorite, Luca Teal in the game, her her side story is one of my favorites, and that the like yearning for identity, the fear of loss of identity is something I resonate really strongly with, and what I've enjoyed about all the games, especially in Bloodborne. I think identity was really unique in that because if you obsess and hyperfixate over it, like me and Lux obviously did for 7 years, stuff like Eileen, and it's not just about your identity, but her place in the world and what she's supposed to do in the world. And I really fixate on those aspects of the story. And that's one thing Dark Souls does. I don't think people talk about. A lot of people just, mention it's dark, it's grim, but it's not grim just to be grim. I think there's a purpose behind the very subtle things they do, and I think identity is the one that always stands out to me the most.
Mhm.
And I think a core part of Souls, along with the prevailing sense of dread and despair and everything falling apart, the nihilism of Souls, is paired well with the enduring joy of overcoming challenge
Mhm.
and personal growth. And part of that is definitely part of the allure to it that we both love as well. Obviously, the themes are stuff that fits well with death doom when it comes to the sad part of things, but when it comes to just enjoying the games themselves and coming back to them over and over, it's that sense of uh personal achievement, that sense of accomplishment, that feel good, just wow, this is something that was such a big challenge for me to overcome, and that also can help parallel with things that we've gone through in real life because we both struggled with a lot of things in our lives. And
Mhm.
Dark Souls has always been there for us through all of them at this point in the last decade or so. Um,
Mhm.
it's something that we get to associate with all of those little slices of our lives that came around each game coming out and as we played through each game.
And it almost runs parallel to maybe like you have these game series that will put out a game at a certain point in maybe your life, like the Elder Scrolls. You get to go into Morrowind, into Oblivion, into Skyrim. It's very similar to like a band you might love, who like this is their album, and it was where you were at this time. This album represents this era in their life and your life, and back and forth. And I think there is that kind of just similarity in just the idea of like releases.
Yeah, definitely. And I think Despairing Fates, that first one, was really unique for us in the way um, it was very spontaneous. We wrote, recorded, mixed and released it and everything in like 5 or 6 months, something like that. All the like even the vocals were all done in a single session in a bedroom. Um, and it was that album I know for both of us lines up with a lot of like kind of key moments, I guess, are really impactful moments in our lives that still, have shaped how we live and do things today.
So, what do you what do video games offer? What is part of their appeal that separates it from other art forms or mediums? What is unique about games, that experience?
Games for me, the large draw of gaming is the interactivity.
Mm-hmm.
The like no other medium, a video game can make the audience part of the art. So one of my favorite genres of video games is walking simulators, which a lot of people don't like. They try and say that they're not games. I personally think they're one of the best kind of games because of the immersion and being able to put yourself into the experience and be part of the experience.
Mm-hmm.
So and I, I know it's an RPG, but Skyrim isn't that far from a walking simulator. You're just swinging a sword. So, yes, there's a great deal of immersion when you're playing a video game as opposed to just staring at a piece of art and gleaning what that piece of art says to you and maybe what the original artist's intent was and that kind of stuff, or listening to a piece of music and what the inspiration behind the music was or what that music means to you. With a video game, you've got your hands literally on your hands on with the experience, and I love that.
100%.
And I think too, even in games where everything is predetermined, it's a linear storyline, which is, probably most of the games we play for most of our lives were like that. Even though it's predetermined, the fact that you're progressing it and doing the actions manually immerses you in the story in a way that, like watching a movie wouldn't. Because it can't progress without you saying so, without you doing something and taking an action. And walking sims, like Lux said, I think kind of play into that really well because even though it's a walking sim, that's you still have to put in the effort to like explore and glean meaning from something. And generally, especially with walking sims now, um, I'd say that they're probably one of the most narrative heavy games. Even if there's a sparse narrative, there's always something um, very deep into it. Like, not that I'm trying to trigger Lux into a lecture, but Everybody's Gone to the Rapture was a fantastic one. That was an example of that. And just getting immersed into that story, at least for me, that's always the appeal of any game, first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of people like I can deal with a bad story if the gameplay is good, and that's true for me too. But I can deal with literally no gameplay if the story is amazing.
And I have to, echo what both of you said. When I play an RPG that I really enjoy, part of that appeal is that it's such a more active way of consuming the content. Where if you watch a film, there's the beginning and the end, and you sit there and you absorb what you were given. Books typically would be the same way. Obviously, there are stuff like Tolkien's work that has multiple pieces that you can kind of bring together, and it's kind of more closer to like maybe like playing an RPG. But for the most part, that experience of like, okay, I get to self-direct this, and I get to have this freedom to explore this new world, and maybe even not do it in a certain order for something more like open world RPGs that I really love. And it's I get some freedom in that, and that to me, and just being able to have control, I get to train this skill how I want to train it, and that has implications, and that's cool to me. I really enjoy that aspect of gaming that I don't get from other art forms.
Yeah, and I think RPGs do a really good job of that, especially with the rise of like decision-based like storytelling.
Hmm.
Mass Effect was another big one for me and Lux back in 2007. Um, the ability to not just participate in the story, but shape it in some meaningful way. Those were also really big influences on us, and I could go on for hours about Mass Effect alone. But
Hmm.
RPGs, I think, RPGs specifically, I think appeal to metal, specifically because of like metal's association with um, like all the classic mythology and like Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s or tabletop role playing games in general. It's
Yeah.
just a natural fit.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of power metal deals with dragons and fantasy, and so does like the Elder Scrolls series, where also like there's a lot of death metal that it has like sci-fi themes, and even in other genres of metal too. And there are definitely game series that lean towards that. Fallout, for example, and so just lore wise and themes and settings that both metal and video games tend to draw from, there is just an overlap.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Brett said, with especially decision-based RPGs, we find a lot of personal freedom to influence the story the way that we might want to experience it if we
Mm-hmm.
were in the shoes of the protagonist. So it's definitely given a lot of freedom of expression into the RPG genre as it keeps on growing and becoming uh, a new thing in the West and in the East. I like to see a lot of what is going on as far as like the Persona series. Persona 5 is one of my favorite video games of all time.
Mm-hmm.
And I love those games. And I love the way that that game in particular has grown into more of a meta narrative of social idealism and commentary and political commentary. Not to say that wasn't always a part of it, and all JRPGs have always had that.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like it's bringing it into a modern context, and I look forward to seeing what new stuff is always coming out from RPGs because it seems to be the genre that's always at the forefront of these socio-political discussions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, especially even though some of the modern JRPGs aren't my thing compared to like the stuff I enjoyed in the 90s, that is a really like heavy part of them, bringing the modern world into like the tropes and uh, of storytelling. Let me get the cat out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think RPGs narratively are always naturally pushing that boundary, and that's what is a huge appeal to me for them. Just the storytelling aspect of it. Any way that they find new ways for characters to interact or stories to unfold. You can take very basic ideas and turn it into something like really extreme and grandiose, and um, that appeals to me because I like that aspect of music. I like, especially with Death Doom, I do like sparser music, but that's just very filling. Like Funeral Doom is great, like that mournful congregation, loss.
Yeah.
Just a wall of guitars and a slow melody. There's not much there, but just listening to it is just completely filling.
Oh yeah. I mean, Funeral Doom is it's one of my favorite kind of micro genres because exactly it's something that really covers you. You sit there, especially with a good pair of headphones and the minimalism, but it feels so much in those spaces, and the best funeral doom bands find ways to make the silence interesting and make that silence, compelling and make you sit in there and kind of, the next note hasn't come yet, but still there's something here that I'm engaged with, in those pauses. And that's not easy to do. It sounds simple when you listen to it, when you but to actually put that together and make it seem compelling is really impressive.
It is like specifically like a band like Bell Witch,
Mm-hmm.
80+ minute songs. If you were to look at like sheet music for it, there wouldn't be a lot there, but writing that is an absolute pain. Um,
Yeah.
I've there's some very slow sections in Soulmass songs that you're basically like our little slice of life of Funeral Doom. I think the first time we did that was probably for Artorias or Biswalker. I still remember some songs by the old names. Just a really big slow section um, to set the atmosphere, and I think that's at least the way I process that in Funeral Doom is kind of like um, the ambient music, like in an RPG, just the stuff that's there, consuming and enveloping you constantly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of approach it from my interests in video games. If I was going to compare to those really narrative driven games, very artistic games, which are uh, based more so on the experience, the visual aspect of the game and the immersion. Um, Something like Funeral Doom is so fully immersive as a soundscape that it draws you in. And like you said, you're hanging in between every note, like
Mm-hmm.
waiting for that next one to come and wash over you and wash you away. It's very akin to any one of like my favorite games. Like I would just like maybe throw out Journey. Just what next big chapter awaits me in this game, and what sort of emotional aspect is it going to wash over me in that next chapter?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you don't have an answer to this, we can move on. But I'm curious, what are some other metal bands that you look to that also, at least maybe not directly borrow from video game wars, but at least you can see the tie-in, you can see the themes kind of paralleling in sort of video game universes that you are engaged with or find compelling.
I think the most immediate one I'll think of is even if they're not like directly about video games or stuff, but the Japanese power metal scene. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
that's the first thing that comes to mind, just because that's like so interlinked with a lot of music we grew up with, like '90s JRPGs. A lot of those tendencies in music are really unique just to Japan in general, and Japanese power metal has always been just like at the forefront of that sound and style.
Yeah.
Theirs, Love Bites, they're just that it's a very unique sound that just comes from there, and I think it's really like prevalent even if you were to go all the way back to like the '70s with like jazz fusion stuff like Cassiopeia, all the way up to video game music to like modern power metal now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think if I was going to bring up anything, it would also be in the vein of power metal. Like you said, it shares a lot of the same genre tropes that we see in video games with dragons and going on adventures and
Mm-hmm.
that whole sort of deal. So but I also think along with power metal, related to power metal is always the original like 70s prog rock leanings
Mm-hmm.
that it came from, um and as well the rock operas. I think to name a band that I think does uh music well that's influenced by a game but isn't the music from the game would be like the Proto Men. They take influence from Mega Man games and the Mega Man lore,
Mm-hmm.
but none of their music sounds remotely like like the Mega
No.
Man games. Other than like maybe their earliest stuff, there is a little bit there, obviously. But like if you're gonna point out, like their most popular album, the second one, then that sounds nothing like Mega Man. But it's so entrenched in the lore that it's like cannot be separated from it, and they bring that to their stage show and their whole
Mhm.
persona, and I just kind of love that.
And you speak of lore, the term lore, and that is a huge, video game term, and it's something that I think a lot of people love that are in the video game. That you can, it's not just like a single story. No, there's maybe the story in that chapter, but then you go, okay, what is the backstory of this character? What is this place? How does it tie in to this other place in the game? Where this object I found, why is it here? What is its history? How does it affect my interaction with this world going forward? And you just, and all those pieces get unveiled to you, like gradually, and it just like keeps getting bigger and bigger, and it's never ending. Lore is it can really consume you if you really care about it.
And we're both Iron Maiden fans because I mean, Iron Maiden has always been about the lore. All of their
Mm-hmm.
music is very based in literary concepts,
Yeah.
movies they like, that sort of stuff. So they bring the lore aspect into their music and make it so much a part of what they're presenting that it's inseparable from the music.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the idea of lore too, is has really been shaped by video games that like advertise it, um, or YouTubers that really like dive into it. I always came up, before I was a musician, I was a writer, still am. But lore to me just like was synonymous with like world building. So it's like all the details that make being where you are significant.
Mm-hmm.
And video games are really good at that when they're designed really well. I think that will show up a lot like in horror video games, especially in the 90s when they really started to get big, like Silent Hill 1 and 2, Resident Evil, just details in your environment that tell you something about where you are indirectly. And
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of Dark Souls' whole thing. Um, I know a lot of people would play through games and be like, I have no idea what I just did or why, but it was fun. But if you look into like just you're given some random item in the game and you take it to a place, it seemingly will have no significance, but if you look at the item description and the description of the next one after that, all the details like line up meaningfully. And that's the aspect I like about storytelling, both in music and in video games.
Mm-hmm.
Like in Let Us Pray, a lot of the final song of the album is pieces rearranged or taken apart from the previous songs and just played in like a different tempo or time signature or something like that. That was one of Lux's ideas actually, and that actually had an own outline of itself where I listened to the entire album except for the last song that had been written, and I just picked pieces of it to rearrange. So if you were to listen to it really, probably really closely, you notice stuff like that, and that's kind of like the lore of the music in a way.
On the topic of that song itself, I did the same thing when we were approaching it. When Brett presented the music to me, and I heard it, and he talked about how he wrote it. I went over all the lyrics I had written since I was just writing in order of the songs. So I had all the songs before that finished, and I looked at all the lyrics and said, "Well, I'm just going to do the same thing with the lyrics that Brett did with the song." It's like I'm going to take what I've said previously and sort of rearrange and reinterpret those things to come across with a not only a summarization of what we were talking about with the whole album, but also with a redirection purpose and a different viewpoint, granting different eyes to it, as you might say.
And metal, to me, there is obviously the lore aspect in a lot of metal. You mentioned Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden is a perfect example, but I also think just sound wise, it fits a video game setting. And I'll give you a personal example. I was doing like a cooperative like PVM bossing encounter just last week with a couple people in an MMO I really like. and in the background here I was listening to some power metal, and it just had that like triumphant going to battle with your friends to accomplish something as the themes and the sound of the music, and it fit perfectly into what I was doing in the game. It just was like such the perfect parallel, and it just like the how it worked together with what was going on my screen and in my ears.
I think that extends even beyond video games because I have friends who have talked about how they're playing tabletop RPGs, and they're like, okay, well, for this part of the campaign, we just threw on the Blind Guardian album, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like it fit perfectly because
Yeah.
it's the same thing. It's just it's the that very fantasy driven epic feel to the music that just fits what you're doing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny that mentioned metal bands, during like tabletop games, because back in high school when I was still doing a lot of D&D, we would put on video game music. Um, and the Elder Scrolls franchise, like the Morrowind and Oblivion soundtracks were always on heavier rotation just because they fit the vibe of D&D so well.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's, and to circle back to what we do, is like Dark Souls music and Bloodborne soundtrack. All of that is great stuff for tabletop RPGs. And we have friends who've come to us and said, "Hey, what music from this would fit this thing that I'm doing in my campaign?" It's like, well, here, just have the music that plays during, Solo Cinder boss fight. It's perfect.
Yeah. There's a bar not too far from me here in Minneapolis that has dungeon synth nights, like it's like a one Sunday a month. And for people that might not know, dungeon synth is like it's a form of music that's definitely not metal, but it has a lot of crossover with metal fans because it's rooted in like black metal culture and aesthetics. And that was interesting to me when I heard, but a lot of people, some people get into dungeon synth not through their fascination with metal, but through their fascination in video game, because dungeon synth sonically is very similar to a lot of classic video game soundtracks.
Yeah, I think if there's the largest crossover of any like music to metal, it's got to be dungeon synth.
Mm-hmm.
That is the genre that is like you could put this dungeon synth album into a video game and it fits, or you can just throw it on while you're hanging out the metal bar and it also fits.
Yeah. Or you could just throw it into your metal album, combine it with your guitars, and it just makes it even like this big like dungeon cave sound, and it works too. There's so many there's so much utility to the idea of dungeon synth.
I think that's a big appeal of like the overlap between um, like metal bands, other genres, and video games in general. Is it doesn't take a lot of effort to find connections and overlap things. When we started doing uh, Dark Souls, like once the idea came up, it just seemed like, oh, that's pretty natural. This is like, why wouldn't this be a death metal song?
Yeah.
The stuff that happens, in Dark Souls is no less gruesome or bleak or intense as anything you'd hear like in 90s death metal, like Cannibal Corpse, Dismember, Grave, or early Gore Guts, anything like that.
Yeah. And there's also this the community aspect of it too, right? When you think of like metal music, it is such a tight knit kind of you see someone in their battle jacket and their shirt down the road, and you feel a connection with them. And a lot of people in metal are on metal Reddits or metal social media, and places where people are posting about metal, in places where metal music is being played. There are festivals for metal, and the same is true in video games. It's kind of the subculture is appealing, especially if you get specifically into like a one game. You'll go and you'll find a bunch of YouTubers talking about the lore, the strategies behind it. There'll be books that line up with that game, and there'll be places, there'll be Discord servers where you could talk and work on that game with other people. And I think that's also really appealing to people. And I think it kind of shares that with metal culture as gaming culture also has like that like community appeal to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with metal being the way it always was, being the sort of at least starting off a very counterculture movement of people largely tabletop RPG gamers, those type of people wanting to make music and listening to a bunch of 70s prog and saying, hey, what if we did this but faster and heavier?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very much organic to see communities come together around something that they really love, and all of them exploring the different ways that everybody loves it, what different perspectives they can glean from it, and yeah, it's a self fulfilling, self generating thing. Like you said, every game is going to have its own community, just like every band has its own community, basically at this point.
Mm-hmm. So what outside of the Dark Souls, what are some of your other, game franchises or just games in general that have meant a lot to you that maybe have influenced your writing style or just or simply just huge parts of your life?
No, that's that's a heavy answer. I think in my other band, Last Scales Throughout, I usually do stuff on games that didn't fit Soulmass.
Mm-hmm.
So I've done like Control, um, some indie games like The Music Machine, Horizon Zero Dawn. That one's probably the most modern one that had the biggest influence on me. Horizon Zero Dawn and Forbidden West, like narratively, I think set a new standard for how stories are told.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that extends back, and I think probably for Lux too, the last game before that was like hugely impactful for both of us was Hellblade. Um, we actually tossed around the idea of doing a Hellblade album for a while, but I don't know why we didn't. I think it was just really difficult to kind of encapsulate how intense and personal and niche like that kind of experience is. Because if you haven't played Hellblade, it's really hard to explain like how intense and well researched and thought out the narrative is, like with mental illness and psychosis, um, and those kind of like leaps in games are what stick out to me the most. Anything that's like narratively a new step is what's going to be a huge one to me. So from Mass Effect to Hellblade to Horizon now.
I think if I was branching out anything other than Dark Souls and the stuff that we write about, one of the biggest influences on Dark Souls and one of the biggest influences on all of the games that I've since loved has been Shadow of the Colossus. When I first played that when it came out, totally changed the landscape of gaming for me. It was an experience unlike any other. Um, I kind of grew up loving all kinds of games. I've been a gamer my whole life. Um, and I liked like the Legend of Zelda series and Castlevania and Metroid and all of that. And I love all that stuff. And all of that has had some influence on Dark Souls. But I think more than anything was like Shadow of the Colossus, that feeling of being one, just being one individual against this insurmountable task in this bleak, lonely environment. Um, Facing insurmountable odds.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that's such an amazing game, and I will stand it forever.
Yeah, that one is it's honestly amazing we haven't done a Shadow of the Colossus song or something, but playing that when it came out was I don't think I made the connection to Dark Souls for quite a few years until Lux had mentioned it. But that was definitely a huge one because of the scope and scale of everything. And that's even sparser than pretty much any Dark Souls song. But if you look into the lore people have pulled out of it, it's no less detailed or fascinating. That was I think everyone remembers like that completing that game or fighting their first Colossus. It was just a very unique experience, especially with the ending.
I remember when I was in high school, the games that were very popular at the time were and I was, it was the era of like the 360 and the PS3, were like Halo, Gears of War, Call of Duty, these very linear first person shoot. Maybe Halo is a little more expansive than maybe the other two, but do you think that maybe gaming culture has kind of over time grown to appreciate more of like the bigger world building, like the Elden Ring and the Baldur's Gate, versus that style of like a first person shooter?
Yeah, when you look at the most popular and the biggest selling games, you're still going to see the Call of Duties and that kind of stuff up there. But then you have the juggernauts like anytime a new Zelda game comes out,
Mm,
uh, anytime From Software release a new game, like Elden Ring was enormous and it remains
sure.
enormous. When the DLC drops for it, it's going to become enormous again because everyone's going to rediscover it. Um, yeah, it's I think people there's like these two different schools at this point. It's like a lot of people grew up, like you said, in our generation playing those first person shooter games, whether they were on PC with like the Half-Life generation and that kind of stuff, or they were on console with, the Halo series and like you said, Gears of War and all of those, and Call of Duty. All of that has kind of spawned its own subgenre, subsect of gamers, it feels like. And without getting too much into like how toxic gaming communities are, it feels like that side of it and the competitiveness of that side of it, along with some of like the fighting game community and like and just all of the very competitive games end up having like a more toxic atmosphere, whereas there's the other half of gaming, which is becoming more and more popular, getting more support, and getting more and more fans of like indie titles and RPGs and
Yeah.
uh, narrative-driven games, or just uh, games where you're just chilling, like almost doing nothing, just like Zen games like Animal Crossing or Stardew Valley, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, there's a whole community built around all of that with a whole different aspect and philosophy of gaming. And not to say that there isn't overlap. I mean, plenty of people love both, and
Yeah.
there's stuff to love in both. And I think both of us like games in both of those halves of gaming. It's just it feels like there is somewhat of a disconnect with those two sides of gaming.
And the latter side that we talk about Crossing and Stardew Valley, and it opens up a completely different community of gamers, different people that may have not felt welcome in. I remember the 360 Call of Duty lobbies, and I had the headset, and yeah, and other games too. Those were that was bad. That's all I can say.
Those were certainly some times.
And
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
the same way back on PC. I remember playing the first Call of Duty and Call of Duty 2 on PC, and those lobbies were atrocious. Like there was that dichotomy, I guess, with any new technology that connects people. There's
mm,
going to be extremes of people finding communities and finding places for themselves, and then just the absolute bigots of the world, just a 35-year-old man harassing a 12-year-old on Call of Duty, or the
Or the
opposite,
other way around.
which happened too. Um, I think it was the way the scope of things worked was really interesting, but they do cross over. And I think a good example, like Animal Crossing, was when Doom and the new Animal Crossing dropped during the pandemic. There was a very unexpected amount of support from each community for both games release, to the point of I forget the characters. I think it's Isabel
Yeah,
and
it's
Good
Isabel.
Guy. Yeah, were in fan art and promo. I'm pretty sure in I don't know if they added it in Doom 26 or Doom Eternal after the DLC or before, but there's an Isabel doll I'm pretty sure you can pick up as a collectible now. So sometimes while the culture can be very toxic, and by and large I kind of stay off of it. Those moments where things overlap and connect really well are kind of things that keep me tied to the communities. Those micro niche like examples, things like since Lux is wearing the shirt, speedrunning. Um,
Mhm.
those those kind of communities are what keep me tied to the larger community of both gaming and metal too.
And I think with like you said, where like RPG, blowing up with your Elden Rings. Um, I think part of it too, and it has a lot of similarities to like underground metal. It's been like people are okay just being completely nerdy about the thing, and that's like okay, and like people aren't embarrassed or ashamed of that. It's almost cool to be nerdy, and metal allows for that freedom as well in a lot of ways.
Yeah, metal's naturally very nerdy, I think.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I
That's why I like it.
find it weird when people like push back on the idea that metal's nerdy. Um, but to me, it's always been a haven for, nerds, I guess, or any kind of people who hyperfixate on specific mediums and culture are. I think it naturally draws to it just because, you know, bands dedicate entire albums to single things like Dark Souls or a specific, storyline or book or movie or stuff like that. And the relation to like hyperfixation, which um, is a very prevalent in, communities like ours, is just very obvious and present. So people are they're just drawn to it.
Mhm.
And I know I talked about like the toxicity side of competitiveness in gaming, but I think there's also, I definitely need to mention, since Brett brought it up with speed running, there's also an extremely positive side of the competitiveness in gaming and inherent in gaming itself. It's like ever since the arcades, there were high scores for a reason. There were leaderboards in the game for a reason. People were gathering around to watch people who are really good at the game in the arcade for a reason, and people are still doing that today on Twitch for a reason. um, People love to see people who are excelling at their craft and who are
Mhm.
really good at something. And I feel like metal is, as a genre, that type of music. It's a something that attracts people who want to hear people excelling at their craft. Um, and you can hear that obviously in jazz fusion and classical music, and there's obviously you can take it to the extreme in other genres as well, but it feels like metal has this very um hyper fixated focus on um the excellence of the musician, and praising how great that musician can be at their instrument at conveying either the feeling or just being proficient at playing it.
And I think like maybe like some of the quote unquote cooler music publications, your pitchforks and such, seem to write off metal and prog for that reason, and they'll make the argument, and I in a way I agree that like other music like punk or indie or even hip hop, and I love hip hop, don't get me wrong, that they talk about it's like being like democratizing music and allowing a more of a DIY approach, and that's fantastic, that should exist, and I'm glad it does. But and for a while I thought that too, that was that's great, and but it's still okay to like be drawn to hearing a shredding guitar solo and just like these crazy blast beats and like think, wow, that is an incredible musician, and I want to hear that. That's fun. That's okay to praise.
Yeah, it
Absolutely.
goes into performance too, like seeing
Yeah.
someone perform it. And of course, that kind of like the whole genre of tech death kind of arrived from that. I still remember hearing, the first Necrophagist albums and the first Sonata albums, and just being completely confused as to how like they were doing this. Or even earlier than that, the first Nocturnus albums. Like I was just like, how do you do this on an instrument? Like what how do you move your hands to make this sound?
Or just like even speed metal bands, just how are you playing that fast? Like how is your right hand strumming that fast? There's no possible way. Um, or just not even speed metal, just like listening to Metallica. It's like James Hetfield, how does your right hand work like that? Like I don't understand it sometimes.
And
You know,
it's good because it doesn't always emphasize, I at least in my ideal like form of metal, like the perfection of the performance isn't the most important. So if someone's playing, 230 BPM or something like that, if it's not the cleanest, that's fine. And generally, people I think like hearing that like imperfection. Like obviously, in stuff like tech death, the precision and stuff like that is very highly praised. But on the opposite of thing, like in speed metal, it's just like how are you playing like that fast and that angrily, just and being so aggressive, and it's inspiring to see someone play, perform, and write stuff that is just like it's playing on the highest levels just all the time for the entire length of the album.
yeah. I think maybe that's why people were so blown away by like Painkiller by Judas Priest. That album, because like I think that album, they let loose and just kind of flexed their musicianship, and people loved it. And we're like, so yes, please do that. That is great. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, if anyone had doubt about Glenn Tipton as a lead guitar player, Painkiller to rest.
Yeah, Painkiller definitely a seminal moment in metal and
Mm.
pushing boundaries that we've been talking about.
I talked about this on a podcast the other day, but like when I heard the drum intro to Painkiller for the first time, there was a before and an after that moment, because it's so fast, it's so intense, and it's so precise, and it's not every drummer can do that.
No, and I think that album specifically, that song specifically, to my even though it was done in 90 or 91,
Mm,
that's the birth of like the modern metal sound. Like
sure.
a technical standpoint, like as someone who likes music production a lot, um, the drum sound, the kick drums, the guitars, the way like certain like scooping that kick drum at 500, having a big boost in the high end, like that sound I think was really just cemented with Painkiller, and that still to me is like the birth of modern metal sound that you can still hear now, almost 30 plus years later.
And see how you're talking about that, and obviously it's my job, my channel, to talk about music that way. um we can dissect details in metal. Like it's a genre that allows for that, in the way that video games also, you can talk about the mechanics, the artwork, the lore, all these pieces that come together, and you can be very nitpicky about it because you care so much about the art form.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was gonna say as a speedrunner myself specifically, it's like I very much like to look at the mechanics of a game as I'm playing it. How can I optimize this game? How was this game originally optimized by the people who developed it? What ways can I possibly break this game? And if I break it, how is that going to affect the rest of the game? What other things might that unlock for me? How can I do this faster? It's definitely an analytical approach to things that you may not see in other aspects of things.
So I have talked about it before, but I am a massive RuneScape fanatic, specifically the old school version, and I play many hours every day. When I'm editing, I am playing that game. But a lot of people remember RuneScape as this very simple point click game, right? But people don't understand is like the best players in the world at RuneScape have learned the game engine and know that the game operates on a tick system. It's 100 beats per minute. So if you have that internalized, you know exactly when to eat your food. You know what some food starts on is consumed on one tick and one on another tick. I don't know why, but you can combo eat that way. If you know how your character moves, you can manipulate kind of the pathing in the game. If you count your ticks right, you can combo special attacks, and it makes something that seems so simple to an eye that doesn't understand what's going on be extremely complex, and I find that so fascinating.
Yeah, that's what we would
Pretty
call
much
like this yeah, that's what we would call the skill ceiling of a game is there might be a very large base as far as attractability of a game and how many
Mm-hmm.
people can play it and enjoy it. And then once you start applying the 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 things that you can find that are skill based or very luck based
Mm-hmm.
and honing in on how you can best approach those and develop those skills and maybe manipulate that luck um, is how you end up taking the skill ceiling up to somewhere far beyond what like a casual player would play a game.
Mm-hmm.
So uh, to say we've been saying metal listeners they're going to approach a band and casually maybe like, oh man, this band is awesome, I really love this band, but then they might hear like one album and be like, oh my god, this album is awesome, and they start to fixate on the way the album was produced. Like, wow, I really like the way that they produced this part of it, and the
Mm-hmm.
way that the kick drum sounds and the way the guitars are, what stuff did they play that with, what kind of drums were they using? What kind of amp board did they have? What pedals did they have? What guitars were they? And you start getting further and further and deeper into the rabbit hole
Yeah.
until you become the musician and you're trying to emulate that sound yourself.
Yeah, no, it's yes, rabbit holes. And same thing with video games, you one piece leads to another, and all of a sudden you are 10 wiki pages and 30 YouTube videos and a whole hour long of Reddit scrolling to figure out this one piece that leads to another piece. And it can get intense.
I mean, yeah, we are neurodivergent people, but I think that's just it's general. It's for
Yeah.
everybody.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, let's talk about just games contemporary right now. Have you two played Baldur's Gate 3? Because that's kind of the game that a lot of people are talking about right now.
That's Brett.
Yeah, I've been playing it since it released on console, on PS5.
Mm-hmm.
Currently stuck at the end of the game because of a bug that I know Larian is working on. But I'm also playing the new Cyberpunk 2077 DLC.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big fan of that game. I love everything about it. That's another kind of jump up in storytelling and world building for me. I think aside from those two, I know there was other ones I played that I really enjoyed. The last Aliens game, which basically no one knows about, Fire Team, or not Fire Team, Dark Descent, um, was an incredible game. I absolutely love the hell out of that. Still replay it, and then of course the obvious one for both me and Lux, at the month and or at last month and now was Armored Core 6, which I had been waiting for a very long time. I was a big fan of Armored Core games as a kid, and when I first played Armored Core 6, just less than a month ago, I fell in love immediately. I obsessed over that game very intensely.
Yeah.
Uh, Played it three or twice back to back before Baldur's Gate came out, and plan on going back very soon. And obviously, we liked it because the EP is about Armored Core, which we didn't. We had actually thought we would intentionally not do
Yeah.
when we heard Armored Core was being released, because our next album kind of covers a similar vein. But we love the game too much to ignore it.
Why? Why do you love the game so much?
I
It's
mean,
probably the perfect like distillation of like mechanics in a game.
Yeah.
Everything about it is just very honed to perfection. Not only is it challenging in a lot of ways, but it doesn't, unlike previous Soulsborne game, it's not bent on being difficult. Not that there's anything wrong with that, this game just feels like it was made by people who like mecha combat games and wanted to have a ton of fun, and that's exactly how it came out. One of the it's the most fun I've had with the game in probably like 5 years or so.
Yeah, I think Armored Core 6, and to talk about recent games, it's like that is the one that I've hyper fixated on and have been playing the heck out of recently, is um very much catered to Brett and I specifically, because we're both such big fans of like mecha and mecha anime, and grew up watching that kind of stuff. So and Brett played the Armored Core games. This was my first Armored Core game. I hope that they bring some of them to modern console after
Mhm.
this, and I get to experience some of the other ones, because they're kind of hard to get for older consoles and stuff like that. But um, yeah, I think that the main draw for it is not just because we're so much interested in mecha in general, and the games themselves obviously love mecha genre and were created by people who created the mecha genre.
Mhm.
But the games themselves have a lot of what we loved about the Soulsborne franchise kind of built into them, brought into Armored Core in a way. Some of the mechanics that could fit in Armored Core were brought into it, but it's still very much it's very much its own thing. It's just not a Soulsborne game at all.
Mhm.
Um, and it's so perfectly crafted that you can approach it from whatever way works best for you as a player. There's going to be certain situations that might take a little bit of puzzle solving, and
Mhm.
you might approach it differently from somebody else, but you're going to get to the same result ultimately. And I kind of love that about the game. There's so much variation, but the mechanics are so solid that anybody can overcome anything without resorting to just one specific strategy.
Yeah, and that's beautiful.
And if you do have a problem, just put on tank treads.
Just throw on the tank treads and you're good to go.
uh, well, maybe a slightly different direction, but you did earlier in this conversation mention kind of the socio-political aspects of some games, and I want to kind of take that more into kind of a meta look, and then like just like of gaming culture. And I think it, and maybe this is just my observation, but I think what's happening in gaming culture now is somewhat mirroring what I'm seeing in metal culture, in that inclusion, like queer inclusion and visibility. We're talking about games like Celeste, uh, has grown exponentially over maybe the past 10 years.
Yeah, I love the Celeste community in general. Such a great
Yeah.
game, such a great community that built up around that game, both casually and speedrunners. And I agree. I think there's definitely been a push over the last decade and going forward, where there is more inclusion for all walks of life to enjoy gaming and see
Hmm.
themselves in games. I think that's only going to be something that's going to increase going forward. The vocal minority who keep on pushing back against it and saying that it's something bad, they're a vocal minority at this point.
Hmm.
um Especially in the wake of what we talked about at Animal Crossing New Horizons. When the lockdown hit and it seemed like that came out at the same time, just serendipitously brought this whole new community into gaming in general. Everybody bought a Switch, everybody was playing Animal Crossing New Horizons, and suddenly there was this whole new group of gamers, among women, among non-binary people, and neurodivergent communities, disabled communities, all these other walks of life that you wouldn't normally see among gamers were
Hmm.
suddenly playing games and getting into gaming. And I think it's only going to proliferate from this point on. We're seeing the beginning of something new right now.
Yeah, and I think the speedrunning community, especially since like I've been into speedrunning like mostly just as a consumer, since like the early Doom days. But like in 2016 or so, Lux had mentioned, games done quick, which I surprisingly did not know about back then. I don't know how that worked out, but a lot of the communities that support those games now, I think, arise out of speedrunning communities. And if you're a part of it, you'll know like those are full of queer and neurodivergent people. That, at least from my experience, that is like the community. And like that's like the foundation for the support of so many indie games and even AAA games. Just starts like at that speedrunning level. People who stream it, keep that game alive, and that inclusion's only grown, especially like when the pandemic hit. Everyone was exposed to these various communities, um, and just realized that there's all these amazing people, and it made things a lot more welcoming for a lot of people, myself included. Um, and I think that's only going to keep growing and, getting bigger and bigger. I don't think it's not going to stop. There's, of course, that vocal minority, but that's just, the negative. That's what the internet feeds us, of course. The communities aren't going anywhere.
And as the community grows, the base of people who are just playing the games also are people who are transitioning into making the games. And we're seeing a
Mhm.
lot more people from these communities making their own games, especially since how big Celeste was. It showed a lot of people that, hey, trans people can make games, they can be
Yeah.
successful at it, and there can be entire communities that are built around it and support it, and hey, I can do that too. So we're starting to see more of that, and I think we should.
Well, and in the same way that happened in metal, Rob Halford came out and became a voice for the LGBT community, and people who like Judas Priest and identify with that are now making metal music. And there is a minority. I will know because I get them in my comment section that hate that there are more queer people into this music, but it's happening and it's going to continue to be a thing. And there are bands that have queer members and queer producers, and it's a reality and it's part of the scene, and people are gonna have to deal with it.
And it's kind of it's always been there though. As the thing. It's like
Yeah.
Rob Halford hid it for so long until he came out,
Yeah.
but it was always there. He was always gay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we kind of like it's kind of funny to us. It's like almost our whole circle of friends from back when we first met each other on those metal forum days. A lot of us that still talk to each other and still have our group chat now, we all like come out. It's like it's just like we were always like this. So um I think a lot of it was always there and is just now feeling more free to be ourselves.
And going back to talking about those Call of Duty, chat lobbies, hearing all the homophobic slurs and all that, you know, fuck, how many years ago was that? I mean, over a decade and a half ago that I was playing those games. But now I am running MMO raids with other queer people and other trans folks, and it's normal. And that's phenomenal.
That's true. And I remember we were talking about like in our group chats once, like, and as a joke, and he says like, how can you even be in a metal band without like a queer or trans person now? Just because if you look at some of the albums that have come out that have really been big, like especially like in our niche community of like metal Twitter, are made by gay and trans people. Um,
Yeah,
that Sonya album was huge, like among us, and still is such in a package.
phenomenal record.
Yeah, I mean, I could listen to that album. I'll be listening to that album in 30 years. It's and I think that kind of we're going to see more of that, of more diverse creators releasing albums that are going to be really huge. And even for me specifically, I know you've talked to Alicia. Doing stuff with Transgressive and getting to work with that has been huge for me, and that is another aspect that all the fundraising she's done for those charities. We're going to see more people just be very brazen about it and open, and you're going to have more albums like the Transgressive and Sonya albums come out, and they're going to be huge and impactful, and eventually, that vocal minority are just going to have to deal with it. These are the people making the best albums right now.
Mm-hmm. And there is, for me, and I was asked this, by another podcaster, you don't really, are you a trans YouTuber. And I'm like, no, I'm a metal YouTuber, but I do get to insert myself and my identity in a corner in a media of like metal YouTubers that up to this point was predominantly a lot of white dudes. And I am just saying I'm gonna do it too. And I feel because of what I've seen in metal that I am free to do that. And I owe it a lot to a lot of these artists that are, just being, paving the way in that regards.
Yeah, as the years go by, it's like you said, it's not going to be the thing that defines the us in these genres and as people. It's going to be the things it's just part of who we are. It's who we are anyway. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just no big deal. It's we're not going to be sequestered um to be to bring up something along the same lines maybe 10 years ago, women in metal being off their own thing. Oh, this is the female fronted metal community.
Yeah.
No, now it's just the metal community. People don't even really
No.
talk about that. Brett's sitting there with an Unleash the Archers shirt, and nobody would call Unleash the Archers female fronted metal today. They're just like, that's a power metal band, and they're
Yeah.
amazing. So as time goes by, nobody's gonna be like, oh, well, there's this awesome trans black metal band. No, they're just an awesome black metal band. So it's something to
Mm-hmm.
look forward to.
On the other hand, though, it is in a way there is some utility to like having that categorization if the artist wants it, because people of that minority group can see it like, oh, there's somebody that has a similar walk of life doing this, and I can enjoy this because I see another face doing it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely an important aspect of seeing yourself in something, as always. Like for me, the last few years, like when I went through like realizing I was autistic and finding once I started looking at things through that lens, like I saw like characters in books and musicians and stuff, it became like important to me to like find those connections and communities. And that was another thing the speedrunning community was also very prevalent in. That was very welcoming. And same thing with like the queer community. Just seeing that and knowing like you have a place among people that also do these things um, is is really important. And I get some people do want to separate it, which I understand, and some people want to do the opposite. They're integral and inseparable. Um, and I think over time we're going to end up with both, but it's not going to be. Um, I guess if it's like the female fronted power metal thing, or just female fronted metal in general, when you had all those lists going down of like uh top 10 hottest female fronted bands or whatever, stuff like that. Um,
Yeah.
you're not gonna have that like kind of marketing thing where the identity is just completely just ignoring who they are as a creator, whether musician, producer, writer, gamer, speedrunner. It's those kind of things are important to avoid. But it is also really good just to see yourself in somebody else creating something like that, and um, it kind of prevents that sense of isolation in what you're doing. Which, as any creator will tell you, there is we ultimately do find value in connecting with people through our work. We obviously just love doing it because we love doing it, but that that connection with other people, even if it's like the other person I'm just making music with, is very integral, and that is ultimately something I think we crave. That's natural for humans.
Well, bringing back my own interest in gaming, one of the most prominent content creators for RuneScape is a trans woman. And even other, cis straight uh, faces in kind of that community, when transphobic or homophobic things have happened on, say, the Reddits or just the communities around RuneScape, more and more people are speaking out in defense of like the LGBT community in prominent roles within this gaming scene. And RuneScape, people may not know this, but has become this kind of haven for a lot of trans players. A lot of trans women specifically are finding this old MMO and are being, you know, big players and big, sayers in where the game goes. And it brought me into it. It that appealed to me. So that's I find that really cool and find that direction in metal and gaming is just becoming more and more reality.
Yeah, and metal especially, I think it's been happening for a long time, but it's definitely becoming more prevalent now. Um, and obviously, there's going to be pushback to that, but it's overall obviously a way better thing. And it's just I went through a period of probably like maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I was really detached from like metal community as a whole, and to an extent, I am, for some other various reasons, but like meeting a lot of people like on metal Twitter like the past 4 years or so, and just like our life journeys like with Lux, Alicia, all these other people in our group chats have like made me like reconnect and appreciate the communities I can still have like in this music that I love so much.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we are running close to time, but I want to give the floor to you, Brett and Lux, to just give any closing thoughts and to plug your own music, tell people where they can find you, tell people what's happening next with Soulmass, maybe your other projects. Take it in any direction you want.
I'll just go ahead. I'll get the plugs out of the way, I guess. Like we mentioned, Soulmass is going to have an EP that we just are dropping out of nowhere, basically, coming out on October 6th. Um, it is called Selling Rubicon by the Pound. It's based on
Definitely not a reference to anything.
not a reference to anything. That is tongue-in-cheek humor. But yes, it's based on our love of Armored Core 6, and it's some music that's in the same vein of Let Us Pray, and we kind of had leftover sitting from Let Us Pray, so we hope people like it. We thought it's a good set of songs, so we look forward to hearing what people have to say about it. Otherwise, we do have a another album that is in the can. We'll have more to talk about that very shortly.
Vic?
But I'm not going to reveal what it is just yet, but in the coming months we are going to announce it and drop it very soon afterward because we have had
Cool.
it finished now for I think like 5 or 6 months. It's ready to go.
Yeah,
So
and
if you want to listen to our music though, Soulmass, Bandcamp, go.
Yeah. Go. If you're watching this, go listen to Soulmass.
we've got the EP and the album coming out, and I have another band, Last Scale Shroud, where if it's very similar nerdy type music where all the songs either about games or books or movies I like, stuff like that. More on the progressive side of things. Um, and I think that's pretty much it for me. We got the stuff coming out Soul Mass. I do have a new Last Scale Shroud album coming out probably next year after we get the Soul Mass stuff settled. Just depending on how things fall.
Well, Brett, Lux, thanks again for joining me. This was a blast. I really enjoyed this conversation. For those watching at home, once again, check out Soul Mass's music. I will put that link down below. In the comment section, please, I'd be very interested to hear what are your tie-ins between gaming and metal. If you do play games, what metal records do you like to listen to when you play games? And with that thought, my name is Maddie, aka Beaver Mosh, and I am signing off.